Just like zebras, horses and donkeys are cousins from the Equine family and share a very similar anatomy. They eat the same and run in a similar way. Humans domesticated the latter 2,000s of years ago, and thanks to them we built cities, traded over long distances, and conquered empires. But what about zebras? Why haven't Africans been riding them for centuries? Where are the cowboys of the savannah? And why, if we were able to domesticate the horse? Well then, today in Memorias de Doli, we are going to explain a bit of all this. The truth is that there have indeed been several attempts throughout history to tame these animals. The colonial era of Africa, from the late 19th century and 20th century, was a real disaster, but regarding zebras it has left us anecdotes in the form of photographs that are honestly quite funny. And it is that European colonizers thought that the resistance of these animals was perhaps something worth taking advantage of, although they failed resoundingly. The zebras escaped, bit the soldiers, and gave away the position by screaming too much. We must also count the eccentric rich people who insisted on driving zebra carriages through the center of large cities like London. But, as said, it cannot be said that there has been much success, and these examples are nothing more than little anecdotes. First of all, we have to differentiate between two concepts that are often confused and are actually totally different: taming and domesticating. Taming is when a specific animal is trained to tolerate humans, like for example, a lion in a circus. The lion still has wild instincts, and if it reproduces, its offspring will be just as wild. However, domesticating is a slow process of cumulative genetic changes that lasts centuries. Humans select the most docile animals with useful characteristics over many generations, until the species changes both physically and in the way it behaves, and ends up adapting to live in close relationship with people. Okay? And now, what happens with zebras? In reality, when it comes to domesticating an animal, different factors intervene, and depending on the species, some have more importance than others. Zebras have a more aggressive behavior than horses. They are real punkies with an unpredictable character and a tendency to bite and kick at the slightest. And be careful with them, they have a kick capable of breaking a jaw and even killing a lion. In addition, the chronic stress of zebras inhibits their reproduction. A terrified zebra does not have offspring, and this is obviously something fundamental for domestication. But in recent years, scientists have found evidence of a factor that is probably the most important in the case of zebras: capture myopathy. Some wild animals, when they are chased or handled, can experience extreme panic that triggers a kind of nasty short circuit. And it is not necessary to physically injure the animal. The stress they suffer is so intense that it causes serious damage in their muscle fibers and severely affects both the heart and the muscles in general. This can lead to paralysis, metabolic problems, and, in many cases, sudden death or a few days later. At first glance, this of an animal dying of fear may seem like a weakness, right? And, well, yes, although in reality it is the evolutionary price that must be paid for being an exceptional survivor in a very dangerous environment. Let's go to Africa to imagine the life of a poor zebra living in constant tension when lionesses, a group of hyenas, or African wild dogs are not stalking them. The young have it even worse, since leopards and cheetahs are also around. They cannot even drink water or take a calm dip because of crocodiles, which look like cursed floating logs. And as if that were not enough, there's always the possibility that a buffalo or a hippopotamus feels threatened and goes crazy. And of course, the icing on the cake remains humans. To survive in these conditions, zebras developed an explosive reaction capacity that at the slightest allows them to flee at full speed. And this is biologically linked to being more vulnerable to muscle damage, that is, to myopathies. It is all or nothing. Their body goes to 100% to save their life in seconds. But if that stressful situation is prolonged, like for example, when a human tries to capture you, the system simply collapses. But why the horse yes and the zebra no? In the end, the environment where a living being lives is key, since it is what defines the selective pressures that make it follow one evolutionary path or another. The zebra has had to live for tens of thousands of years and up to today, surrounded by real killing machines, where surprise attack is constant and close. That is why the individuals that survived were those that best panicked and ran, and these were passed on to their offspring. But the ancestors of our horses did not live in Africa, but in regions of Eurasia. Be careful. Here, there were also terrifying predators such as hyenas and cave lions or enormous wolves and bears. But something key happened just in time. Some of these predators decreased or directly went extinct. So when humans began to domesticate horses in Eurasia, they had already spent thousands of years living in a more relaxed environment. In addition, their survival strategy was also different. The steppes did not require an explosive and extremely fast reaction, as in the case of zebras. Their main defensive strategy became sustained flight over long distances, So what they needed was rather physical resistance, and therefore this may have favored that ancient horses developed a somewhat more manageable stress response. Thus, they better tolerated that humans approached them and handled them to begin the domestication process. This does not mean that horses cannot suffer from capture myopathies, but nothing to do with the extreme case of zebras. Okay, now let's go with the last part of the video. How was the domestication of the horse? Let's start with a stage prior to domestication, where nature gave us a hand. And it is that deep down all this we are explaining has to do with genes. Before humans appeared on the scene, ancestral horses developed genetic variants that turned out to be key to being able to domesticate them. One of these very important genes is ZFPM1, which plays a fundamental role in the development of certain neurons responsible for releasing serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter responsible for regulating mood and aggressive behavior. In fact, this gene has been studied in mice, and when it is deactivated, it causes them anxiety and fear. And what happens in horses? Well, variants arose that made some individuals more docile, less anxious, and more resistant to stress, and this was taken advantage of by humans about 5,000 years ago in the first stage of domestication, the phase of advancement. The first steps were purely psychological, that is, to obtain animals that did not panic. The second stage began about 4,200 years ago, and we can call it the phase of body engineering. And here another gene was key, the SDMC gene. For years, it has been known that in humans, this gene is related to spinal health and chronic back pain. Well then, recently this gene was deactivated in mice, and the results were very cool. Not only did their spines change shape, but also the mice became stronger in the front legs and moved with surprisingly better coordination. The truth is that this is crazy. That is, humans acted as a filter and began to intensely select horses with the variants in this gene that contributed to a stronger and more stable back. This coincided with the appearance of horseback riding in chariots. That is, we selected horses capable of supporting the weight of a rider or pulling carts during long journeys without getting injured. By the way, it also coincides with the massive expansion of the Dom-2 lineage, from which almost all current domestic horses derive. In summary, unlike the zebra, the domestic horse was shaped first by nature and then by humans to better tolerate stress and withstand continuous work. And that's it for today's video, friends. What did you like? Just imagine how much more aura Cleanest Boot would have had if in any of his movies he had ridden a zebra. We read you in the comments. Tell us what you thought of the topic and what you would like us to talk about in the next videos. Greetings, and until next time.